So that's all about our gymnosperms. And remember, our gymnosperms mean naked seeds. They make seeds, similar to angiosperms, but nothing is protecting it. Our angiosperms, however, do have protection around their seeds. So the phylum that all angiosperms are part of is phylum Anthophyta. So Anthophyta. Their seeds are protected, and that's really the main difference between the gymnosperms and angiosperms, is that angiosperms make some sort of additional protection for their seed. Generically, we think of fruits, and I'll talk about fruits like apples, but know that not all plants make an obvious fruit like that. Some of these, I'm trying to look, so for example, rice, it's fruit. Rice is the odd one. That was not a good example. Oaks make acorns. Acorn is a fruit, at least in the scientific sense. Inside of that acorn is the seed. So all fruits aren't just, apples. In the scientific sense, it just means something that is covering that seed. So as I mentioned, our angiosperms also have flowers. You have to have a flower if you're going to have a fruit. So the flower is growing from the sporophyte. Remember, the sporophyte on all species except moss, sporophytes are what you see. These are the actual plants that are outside. So the flower is found on that sporophyte, and it's within this flower where those gametophytes can be found. So the flower is kind of analogous to the cones of a gymnosperm. The cones was where the gametophytes were found. Here, the flower is where the gametophytes are found. And the job of the flower is really to keep the eggs and the embryo protected. Not only do they offer protection to the egg and embryo, which is usually found deep within the flower, but you've also noticed that these flowers are so very different from one another. And that's because they are trying to develop a relationship with a pollinator. The goal is to get your pollen from your plant to another plant. Well, one way to achieve that, really the main way to achieve that, is the use of other organisms. So a lot of these flowers are specially designed with another organism in mind. So I'm going to take kind of a roundabout detour to talk about this flower specification. And this flower specification is an example of Coevolution. So and then the word evolution. What this means, the co means cooperatively, together. Plants and their pollinators evolved together, some more so than others. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to focus on this hummingbird and these flowers. So I'm going to go to a blank screen and kind of talk about this a little bit. So imagine you're this flower. We're going to go back to natural selection. This flower naturally had genetic diversity, and it had all different size shapes. The shapes might not have been that different from one another, but a little bit different. So let's say we had, these skinny ones, slightly wider ones, and maybe even wider ones. Maybe they had the same general shape, same color, same smell, but how wide they were was different. Now, no matter the width, it's going to attract pollinators of some sort or another. If you look at this flower, so this is the whole flower. This is like the little trumpet where all of the sugars and stuff are found. If you look at the big flower, a whole bunch of things can pollinate it, right? I mean, a bee could get in here. Birds, no matter the type of beak they have, could get in here. So all sorts of things could get in here. And there's nothing wrong with that. But imagine you do have a bee. A bee gets in here. Now the bee really isn't specialized for anything, so it's going to go to this plant over here and this plant over here. So the bee, because it doesn't have really any special modifications, it can pollinate a whole bunch of different types of flowers. It's not specializing. Now the reason that's, I guess, bad is because when he gets pollen on him from this plant, he goes over here and gets more pollen. So this is the bee. He gets more pollen, but it's different pollen. And the pollen that was on him, it falls on this flower, but it doesn't matter. It's not the same species. And when this bee goes over here, some of the pollen on him falls, but doesn't matter. It's not the same species. No fertilization takes place. So for the plant, this isn't super advantageous. Yes, you want pollinators to come to you, but you kind of want to guarantee that what's going to come to you, like, will keep fertilizing you, right? Now, the plant doesn't know this, obviously, but what does happen is maybe this plant doesn't reproduce. There is so many different pollinators coming to it, and those pollinators are going to all other types of plants that very rarely do any of the pollen actually get to pollinate its own species. Now let's go on to the other spectrum. This flower that just happens to be skinnier, bees can't really get in there. Bees are way too fat for this. A lot of birds, they can't get in there either. Actually, not that many species can get in there, except the hummingbird. The hummingbird, with its long beak, can get in there. Now, you have other hummingbirds. There's going to be some that have shorter and stockier beaks, some that maybe have the long beak, but they're stockier, etc. So these hummingbirds have variation as well. Now, this guy with the skinniest beak can get into this flower. This is the skinniest flower. Well, that's really nice. But why is it so nice? Well, this hummingbird right here has no competition. It can go to this flower and get all of the food from this flower and have no competition. Other hummingbird species can't reach this flower. Other pollinators in general, like bees, can't reach this flower. Just this guy can reach this flower. So it has its own food source all to itself. Now, while it's feeding, getting the sugars from this flower, the pollen is going to rub off on the beak of this hummingbird. Now, the hummingbird knows, hey, here's a food source, and there is no competition for this food source. So I found another flower that also has a really skinny trumpet. It comes as it's going to feed on that one. So it's not a purposeful relationship where, oh, this flower needs to be pollinated, let me pollinate it. No, it just so happens that this bird is fitting perfectly into this perfectly sized flower, and it doesn't have competition. So no other organism is competing. So it's going to keep going to it because there's no competition. So when it goes to another flower, again, that has a skinny trumpet, it's going to accidentally knock off some of the pollen that was on its face, and it's going to transfer that to this other trumpet flower. So we have two benefits. First benefit is that the flower is getting fertilized by the same species. So this was a trumpet flower being fertilized by another trumpet flower. Therefore, the reproduction of this trumpet flower increases, and the bird is benefiting. The bird has no competition with any other organism. So you're seeing this perfect fit. Now, this type of relationship literally took thousands and millions of years to develop. Again, neither one of them is purposeful. But if a flower happens to have adaptations that make only one type of pollinator pollinate it, it is increasing its chances of that pollinator going to the same species flower. So let me go back to this image to briefly talk about some other types. This is a flower that only blooms at night. So what it's trying to do is attract pollinators at night, which there aren't that many. Bats are pretty much the only thing, pollinating-wise, available at night. So by opening up at night, the amount of organisms available to pollinate it are limited. So these bats are going to go to these flowers, which look at the perfect shape of this flower. So the bat goes to it. It's a really easy meal. It's available at night. And it's going to find other flowers that are really easy meals. And in the meantime, it's brushing off a lot of that pollen. So different flowers, even if you're like, well, this flower doesn't have any cool adaptations, it might not be shape, but instead color. So this is the same flower under UV light, which a lot of insects can see. So they might have some patterns that attract one organism over another organism. So having this specificity is allowing the coevolution of these species. Hummingbirds' bills are getting thinner, which are allowing it to take advantage of thinner flowers. flowers are getting thinner in order to make sure that only hummingbirds are eating on it. Because when only hummingbirds eat on it, they're more likely to pollinate a neighboring flower or a flower of that species. So again, this was kind of a tangent, but talking about the flowers of phylum Anthophyta. That these flowers aren't just, oh, they're pretty. They actually serve an amazing function when it comes to transferring that pollen from one organism to another organism.